Everybody. So this is going to be a straight pitch, just letting y'all know. And we're going to have a QR code on almost every slide for you to join the project. And if you don't take a picture of it now and join, you hate children. It's very simple. We don't need to make this complicated, okay? So first of all, there is no risk in joining the project. Just letting you know, all that happens is that you will probably be sent an invitation to complete a profile. That if you would like to participate in the project over the many years that we will be operating, then it just gives you the opportunity to do so. So there's no, if you join, it doesn't mean you signed up for anything other than, the opportunity to maybe participate in a different way later. We'll talk about the different ways that we are looking for opportunities to gain feedback from others. This is first of all, I'll start and then I'll hand it off to Jonathan and then he'll kind of dive into the first part of the presentation. So I'm Sergio Caltagirone, professor of practice at Georgia Tech. One of the beautiful things at Georgia Tech is I get to do whatever the hell I want. And one of my interests in this profession of cybersecurity is the intersection of humanity and cyber. So where does cybersecurity impact human dignity, and how can cybersecurity either improve, or where does it cause a detriment to human dignity? So because of that, I started a center at Georgia Tech, the Center for Digital Human Security, with some of my other professors and colleagues. And the whole purpose of the center is to generate research, prototypes, and outcomes that directly impact and improve human dignity. Again, focusing on cybersecurity as a mechanism to do so. Before this, I have a long career at Dragos, which you may know, Microsoft before that, NSA before that, and other various projects that some of you might know me from. And so with this, I'm going to hand it over to Jonathan, who will introduce himself and then start talking about why are we doing this, what's the importance, and what's the impact we expect to obtain over the multiple years that this global initiative is going to take effect. Also, by the way, this is the very first time we've presented this. So this is literally the launch of the initiative, and we are going to have many of these sessions in different conferences. So you may see us about as we again try to canvas the entire tech, legal, policy communities to basically change how the world sees this problem.
Great, thanks for that, Sergio, and thanks to the organizers for giving Sergio and I some space to present this project to you. My name is Jonathan Horowitz. I work for the International Committee of the Red Cross. The only thing on this bio that matters is the last two lines, which is I am a very proud father of a one-year-old baby who eats everything and doesn't sleep quite as much as we'd like, and many of you can probably relate to that. For those that aren't familiar with the International Committee of the Red Cross, let me try to make a little bit of sense out of why Georgia Tech and the ICRC have partnered. We're an organization that's been around for about 160 years. We work almost exclusively in situations of armed conflict. We have about a 2 billion Swiss franc budget with around 18,000 people working around the world in around 100 countries, most of them countries where we see situations of armed conflict. What we do there is that we provide humanitarian assistance and we promote compliance with the law of armed conflict, or international humanitarian law, which is the law that regulates how warring parties fight with the aim of putting limits on warfare and protecting civilians and others from the dangers of armed conflict. The reason why we're here, and we can go to the next slide, is that as all of you will know, and that has been clear from the panels from today and more tomorrow, is that civilians, including in situations of armed conflict, the essential services that they need are highly dependent on the digital infrastructure which provides them. At the same time, we are also seeing that military operational continuity may also depend on very similar, if not the same, digital infrastructure. And so the title of our presentation has the word shared in it. And if we think about what it means to live in a digitally shared world, we've heard throughout the day that shared could mean local, state, federal responsibility sharing. It could be public-private partnership through shared. But the things that Sergio and I are looking at through this project are what we mean by shared is when civilians and military are sharing the same digital products and services. And the other thing that we're witnessing that everyone in this conference is well aware of, if not even too much so, is that both military cyber tools and capabilities, as well as now off-the-shelf, more democratized tools and capabilities, are able to find vulnerabilities in that digital infrastructure for purposes of damage or destruction. And what this logically leads to is, I would hope, or recognition that when the digital infrastructure that militaries share with civilians gets targeted in armed conflict, civilians may lose access to essential services. What are those essential services? We've heard a lot about water. We've heard a lot about medical services. We can think about transport, agriculture, emergency first responders. A lot of the conversation thus far has been sort of the prospect of what will happen in the future. But these are things that we're concerned about with regard to armed conflicts that are happening now and armed conflicts that will emerge in the future. The other thing that is part of the shared digital world is, as I mentioned before, the private sector, right? So the digital infrastructure, it's well known, both develops, engineers, manages, owns, and secures the digital infrastructure that both the military and civilian populations rely on. So I wanted to present that as a baseline understanding of how the ICRC is thinking about the digital environment in situations of armed conflict, because it will lead to certain problem sets and hopefully solutions that we're going to try to convince you to become part of with regard to a conversation. Do you want a longer leash?
So one of the things we're working on is what you've heard here at the conference today and what you will continue to hear tomorrow are local, state, and federal, right? But what we want to do here is take you even further, right? Because what we're talking about is an international problem. We're talking about civilians in all war zones, in all conflicts, all over the world. So the project we're working on is going to span every continent, every major discipline, and spend multiple years doing that to find an approach that hopefully as a global community, we can apply not just in the United States, but everywhere. Would you like to introduce the video?
Yeah, so the ICRC has just recently, and this is still a work in progress. So if any of the folks that are recording this session, they will know not to show the video that is forthcoming because it is a work in progress. It's not finalized, but we trust the organizers of this event that you should be able to see this nonetheless. And it tries to dramatize one of these problem sets that we've been talking about a shared digital world and what that can mean for civilians. So we're going to play that. It's about 1 minute and 45 seconds.
We've got a radius response report. Looks like an unexploded munition went off. Multiple children injured. We're on our way.
Hey man, your company is all over the news. Is it true you started working with the military?
Starting today, Radius Response is joining the defense of the homeland. We're going to be using cutting-edge technological solutions and computing power to partner with the military so anyone can send our fighting forces real-time information about enemy encampments, arms locations, and soldier movements.
Huh. Radius response is down. We've lost location.
Whoa, check this out. Radius response taken offline by a sophisticated cyber attack for joining the fight.
Great. Now we can't make it.
If your company provides services to civilians and chooses to also support armed forces, this matters. When a tech company joins the fight, its infrastructure risks becoming part of it. Military use can change how your adversaries view your services, with potential severe consequences for your company, your customers, and people who depend on them. Even wars have limits. Learn about the rules tech company personnel must follow, the risks civilians face when tech companies support weapons bearers, and how companies can reduce harm to civilians at icrc.org/war and tech.
So it's that last one about how can companies help reduce harm that is sort of the genesis of this project that we're going to be outlining for you today. Now, the message of that video, just to be clear, is not around companies should not support belligerents. The message of the video is if they do, they need to understand what risks may be imposed on civilians who also use their products and services. And then through this project, which we'll talk a little bit more about, we'll try to find solutions for mitigating those potential risks. So we've sort of described the core problem in many ways. There's a law and policy issue here. There's a technology issue here. There's an adoption verification issue here. Just for those of you who may not be completely familiar with it, in situations of armed conflict, there is a legal framework that instructs the warring parties how they must behave. I mentioned already the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law. It dictates what may be targeted either through cyberspace or kinetically, but it also dictates what must not be targeted, such as civilians or civilian objects, civilian infrastructure that's used solely by civilians. There are some issues around the clarity of these rules. The ICRC has been working with states. States have been working with one another. The United Nations and other forums have been trying to provide greater clarity where it's needed. There are always issues around compliance. That's nothing unique to cyberspace. Situations of armed conflict, you're always going to have parties where there may be transgressions. But the things we want to focus on is if there are going to be transgressions, and if we know that simply saying stop violating the law isn't the only solution, what are other solutions? And we want to be practical and we want to be solution oriented. But again, that sort of brings me to the sort of law and policy thinking that we've been doing together. And I'll hand it over to Sergio for some additional thoughts.
Okay, so for the last, I don't know, long time, right? Technology, we can talk about digital, but it goes further than that, right? But one element of human technology in general, human technology development, has been economics, right? Is a driving force behind technology, right? It's economics in labor, economics in money or power, but basically, how do I get more with less? How do I do more with less? How do I make what I do mean more? And of course, that leads us to efficiencies towards things like sharing, right? Where we might have a shared infrastructure. Now, that could include things like a shared satellite signal. It could include a shared cloud region. Could include shared 5G core link, anything like that. And on any of these, there can be lots of services provided. Hospitals, we can do even talk about vital statistics of governments. When there's disasters like wars and conflicts, one of the fundamental functions of a government is also to support things like family reunification as people get separated, as people die, identifying victims, notifying families. These are core functions that the ICRC supports, but governments fundamentally are responsible for conducting. And when an attack happens, these things get taken offline. So again, when there's conflict, now you can't do victim identification. You can't do family notification. You can't do family reunification, right? People get separated. People become refugees, right? And how do we now identify who's in refugee camps? What nationality are these people? What government are they? What government is responsible for which individuals? These are really important humanitarian problems to reduce the harm to people who, for all intents and purposes, right, have no fight here, right? By definition of humanitarian law, right, they are not in the fight. They are not supposed to be harmed. And we have a responsibility as not just governments, but as a people, right? We've come to the realization and recognition legally, formally, and ethically that we have a responsibility to all of these people, right? Whether you are in that conflict zone or not, we all have a shared responsibility to support them. And of course, the problem then becomes what happens when all of these services are now shared with, say, military services as well. And then that leads us to the question of, or examples such as a single satellite provider servicing military units in a conflict zone gets taken offline, and now you have energy resources thousands of miles away being equally taken offline, right? For civilians that were not directly involved in conflict, but is now directly harming civilian resources or civilian digital assets and things like power production. So the question we get down to here is, we've built this massive global shared resource, right? The internet. And one of the problems with it then is, how do we segregate combatants from non-combatants in this new digital zone? How do we protect those who we have a legal and ethical responsibility to protect, right? From those who are combatants and are involved in potential belligerence in a conflict. Now, one of the things we don't want to do is we don't want to create multiple internets. That's a terrible idea for lots of reasons. We want to make sure that when we do this, that we have the ability to take a global approach. Because a conflict happening in one region of the world, say Africa, and how we protect and defend non-combatants and civilians in Africa, we should be able to leverage and utilize, just like efficiencies that we gain from other ways, we should be able to leverage those same foundational ideas, technologies, approaches, policies, responses in, say, a conflict in South America. And so one of the things we want to do is build an environment where we can translate technologies, approaches, policies, laws, regulations, whatever they are, in ways that make this internationally applicable. So challenges we have here, right? Which is, well, how far can you really go? Is it good enough to just segregate hospitals from a military base based on satellite frequency? Is that good enough? Is that sufficient? Is that ethical? Does it satisfy international humanitarian requirements for protecting civilians and non-combatants? These are questions that we are asking. We do not have answers for them. Is there a mixture of survivable and resilient versus what we want to be protected but might become fragile? This is something we also have to be very careful and balance, because if we create a heavily protected environment, it may become a problem that then becomes very, very fragile, right? If we take, for instance, and we say, okay, well, all civilian services are going to go live in AWS East, right? And that's great and all, but now that becomes a single point of failure, right? They don't get the support and benefits of, say, resiliency in the rest of the cloud infrastructure. So we got to be careful not to create a protected approach that then becomes more fragile and actually harms civilians in other ways. We used to say at Microsoft, right? When I first joined, we had this saying called bring your own adversary, that every customer we onboarded into Microsoft's cloud, we brought their adversaries with them, right? That is exactly what we're seeing, right, with this, in this shared environment. Every customer you bring on into a shared digital environment, you're bringing the adversary with you. Another problem we have, and this is very much important, this is very much of high importance to the enforcement of IHL, International Human Rights and Humanitarian Law, is verification. When something happens, when a war crime when a war crime happens, we need the ability to, one, know that it happened, and we have to have the ability to investigate and identify what happened and who did it, so that we can enforce the legal requirements on protecting non-combatants and civilians from war crimes and other harms. So this has to be a component of what we build, is we have to have a way of doing this. Now, does that mean in a shared environment between governments and private sector, how does that work? Right? Does that now mean that the government has to have every log of everything that happens? We probably don't want that either, right? And so we have to think through all of these problems. This is not easy, and we don't pretend that it's easy, nor that we may not even get to the right answers during this project. So it takes us to the project. So in the short term, what you see is what you've seen at the conference now, right? Which is we have individual asset owners, operators, service providers taking local action based on things that are happening in the world. We see reactionary responses, reactionary policies from policymakers at the local, national levels. We see the same with private sector, right? Responding to constituent and customer issues. And another thing is we see entire sectors removing themselves from conflict zones. One thing we're also doing is we're getting a lot of case studies. What is happening? Why is it happening? What happened when? And things of that nature. This project, one of the unique elements of this project is, if anyone understands how international law works and how norms are developed over time, this is not a short-term thing. In fact, I will retire well before this project finally actually finishes. We are looking actually 30 years at least into the future. We're looking at how can we set the precedent now? How can we understand what the problems are? How can we identify what the guardrails are, what the major concerns, and maybe the things that are going to stop us from actually doing anything valuable? We're basically trying to get that down generate all of those answers so that we can create the next steps, so that, again, this can take decades to move forward. So we've broken the project down into 3 steps, each one taking approximately a year. The first step is discovery, right? So the goal here is to identify what are the key aspects, what are the key problems and risks of civilian safety. And we're going to do that by looking at what's going on in current conflict zones around the world, talking to and inviting those who are living in current conflict zones to participate, share their experience, their perspectives on what is happening, what happened to them, how did it affect them. Looking at existing approaches, who has done what, right? When a service provider pulled out of this conflict zone, what did it do? How did it hurt people? How did it help people? What, did it protect their constituents? Did the adversaries just move in a different way? The next step is stakeholder engagement, right? So this is a large global effort, including legal experts, policy makers, policy experts, technologists, and so forth. Everybody in this room, basically, who has some sort of expertise in some way on what might be a potential solution, but also what might be the problems in this area. What might stop us, right, from doing this? And the goal here is we will be hosting a global set of workshops to invite people from all around the world to participate in the project. We're hoping to get somewhere about 3,000 global participants in the project. And then the last step is implementation. So this is where we actually move forward with the findings that we've made. But then in addition to that, we're going to be prototyping and deploying solutions, whether those are policy solutions, technology solutions, as ethically as we can, and ethically and reasonably, into conflict zones to test them, to see how do these operate? What would the outcome be if we were to apply this elsewhere? Is this a potential global solution for this? And again, we're not looking at, oh, we just need a new BGP, or, oh, if we just wrap DNS with, encryption, right? That's not what we're looking at, right? This is obviously a multi-scope, multifaceted problem set that's going to require lots of different solutions to work together. Again, the goal is we cannot stop harm to civilians. The goal is to reduce harm to civilians.
So we'll just take a few questions we would ask in terms of your main homework. Grab that QR code right there. We need your insights and your feedback. We'd love to know if you have an experience with the problem set that we're talking about and what the magnitude of the issue is, and whether or not you have any either good solutions or solutions that you've seen that haven't worked. So come and tell us about it. And I think we have about 2 minutes for questions.
Thereabouts. Anyone have questions? Okay, go ahead.
So you started with pre-positioning, and then I kind of lost that thread. But that's something that certainly, like when I was in the White House in the last administration, came up a lot, and lots of questions about normative development around that. So can you talk a little bit about how that issue of it's not in conflict, right? So when I hear, hey, we're looking at conflict zones, I'm like, well, the pre-positioning that I care about is not in a conflict zone, but it is putting options on the table for policymakers that will certainly harm civilians down the road if they're exercised. So how does that fit into the scope?
So think about two things. One is that you're talking about a cyber operation that has intended effects in an armed conflict. And when you have operations that have intended effects in armed conflict, you have to think about how the law of armed conflict applies to those operations, even if they're being planned in peacetime. The second thing to think about is we've talked about the prohibition against cyber operations directed at civilian infrastructure, but some pre-positioning sits on these what's sometimes called dual use targets or dual use infrastructure, where, and we've been talking a bit today about how militaries may be vulnerable, military bases in the US may be vulnerable to operations that are directed at civilian IT or OT. But in armed conflict, what we need to be thinking about is if the military is targeted through the dependencies it has on IT and OT, what implications does that have for civilians, right? And we're starting to hear a little bit more about how pre-positioning is not only directed only at civilian infrastructure, but also at infrastructure that militaries are dependent on, that civilians also are dependent on. So that's where that comes in with regard to planning now for armed conflicts in the future and the pain points that civilians may suffer.
And Nick, I'm not sure if you were talking about pre-positioning by the adversary on us or the other way around, but I presume you're referring to one of those specific scenarios. I had a question, and then Bob, if you're ready to go. So Sergio, you mentioned a couple things like you're asking at least me a techie, and I have no idea, okay, as to how to answer one of your questions. So do you have an inkling of something that points us towards either a policy solution or technical solution, because I have no idea.
Okay, yeah. So I guess to clarify your question a little bit, just very briefly. So you're asking how, if you don't fully understand this problem, you don't have a background in law.
Oh no, I understand the nature of the problem,
Okay.
but like it's such a big problem.
It is a big problem,
Right.
yes.
That changing BGP routing is not going to solve the problem, but
Right.
there's something that you might have an idea around that I would just like
Yes.
to hear.
So, for instance, one of the things one of the ideas, again, we are not positing solutions or recommendations at this point in time, way before that. But one of the things would be something like at least deciding, right, whether logical separation between life safety critical systems and military systems is required. That might be a question we may ask. Or do we have a different tiering of systems? So for instance, in a non-life safety critical system that has shared resources, maybe logical separation is sufficient, but for life critical systems, we need physical separation. So that would be an example of a decision that this project is going to kind of come to, right? Is what is the best approach on, say, a question of that nature?
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you very much for that. All right, any other questions before we have Bob come up and share? Okay,
Great.
Thanks very much.
Thank you all so much.
Thanks so much.
Really cool.